Now, the Mazda 6 Touring is a car that I've liked for a very, very long time. And it seems that there are still fans of this model here in Malaysia because local distributor Burmaz has introduced yet another facelift. But while the aesthetics remain broadly similar, there are some very small changes. The big updates come in terms of specifications. And most importantly, for the first time in the history of the Mazda 6 Touring in Malaysia, this is actually more affordable than the Saloon. In this video, we're going to find out why you should have one of these instead of an SUV. My name is Aiman Abdullah, this is Malaysian Motoring, and before we get into it, be sure to hit subscribe and hit the bell to be notified every time we make a new upload. Now at the front of the Mazda 6 Touring, you can see this is broadly the same treatment that we've seen before. The only changes for the 2023-2024 model year is that now the strip that goes around the grille is done up in gloss black, and the little bottom feeders down here, these are also done up in gloss black. They used to be in chrome. This makes the car look a little bit more sporty, the same way the Mazda 3 liftback also has black accents instead of chrome. These headlights, however, are exactly the same as before, and so they are full LED units replete with an adaptive high beam function, which works sort of like matrix LEDs, but slightly more simplified because this is a Mazda after all. The other change to this particular model for this model year is the colors. Now, this is one of two new colors available for the Mazda 6, and as far as I'm concerned, this color is quite fetching. It's like Nardo Grey from Audi, but with a little bit of metal flake. Quite fetching. Rolling stock has also been updated for this year because while the 19-inch alloys remain the same design and they're still wrapped in the same Bridgestone Turanza T005A tyres, which are pretty good if you ask me, they are now done up in black, again to make the car look a little bit more sporty. There are a few other black elements, including the wing mirror caps as well as the functional roof rails, which means that should you have one of these, you need a little bit more storage space, you can actually fit a roof box up here, although you might not want to obscure the standard fit sunroof. Now, because this is the Touring, obviously the roofline goes a little bit further back before it tapers off quite nicely here. The interesting thing to note about the Mazda 6 Touring over the Saloon is that the wheelbase of the Touring is actually shorter than what you get from the Saloon. Mazda chose to do this because in order to offset the additional weight of the 6 Touring over the 6 Saloon, they shortened the wheelbase in order to make the car feel a little bit more lively and a little bit more fun to drive. Although we'll get into that a little bit later. Now back here, the changes are also quite minimal. You have more black accents up here. You still retain the twin functional exhaust pipes, which actually sound quite fruity for a car like this, but overall the rear end doesn't really need to change much because it's still a very good looking place. Now, the upgrade over the Saloon by getting the Touring comes in terms of boot space. These are where it pays dividends because behind this manual tailgate you will find an absolute expanse of space. And of course, this tonneau cover actually stretches quite intelligently to ensure that all of your items back here remain nice and safe and shaded. And of course, underneath this boot floor, you will find a space saver spare wheel and all of the gubbins necessary to go in there. This is actually quite a neat integration compared to what we've seen before from Mazda, where sometimes the emergency kits can live on top of the boot floor. And of course, as standard, it comes with the Mazda coil mats. Now, you also get a 12-volt socket as well as a couple of these hooks here, but you can also fold the rear seats flat from here, and because they are spring-loaded, they will actually fall forwards. That's actually caught on the front seat, but you can actually push it down, and at that point you create a fully flat load bay which is large enough to fit possibly a fridge. This car is huge. Now in here, again, the updates are very minimal. So you still get the same red leather upholstery, which I think looks fantastic. And it matches up with the rest of the interior where it has this sort of red contrast stitching on the dash and on the doors, and all of this is nice, soft touch material, as you'd expect from what is ultimately a flagship model from Mazda. What has also changed is actually this infotainment system. So while it still runs the same operating system as before, this is not as fanciful or as new as what you get from, say, the Mazda 3 or the Mazda CX-30. The screen itself is now a little bit bigger and the resolution has been improved ever so slightly, which means that when you are using things like Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which this car comes with as standard, although it is a wired system, it does display quite nicely. The instrument cluster also has not been updated, so you still get a couple of analog dials, one for your speed and one for your RPMs, and it's augmented by this little digital screen on the right. That is manipulated by a single button on this side where it shows you a very limited number of options, a very limited amount of information, because Mazda believes that drivers should not be distracted behind the wheel. Although only Mazda seems to believe that. But if you need more information, that is available via the full color heads-up display, which I think is among the best in the business, although again it is a slightly older unit compared to what you get from, again, the CX-30 and the Mazda 3, where it'll show you things like directions and so on from the heads-up display. You do not get that here, but you still get things like your blind spot information system, your speed, as well as other ancillaries, which I appreciate hugely. The other thing that I appreciate is the fact that Mazda has not ditched buttons in this car. So compared to the MX-30, where you get the HVAC controls via a secondary screen, in this car, they are all still very satisfying knobs and buttons. All of these switches feel really nice to use. It feels very satisfying to twist and turn. The same goes for the MZD Connect controller down here, replete with some hard buttons for things to use. And very notably, if you do have your phone plugged in, if you hit the music or nav button, it actually goes into the navigation or music app that you have on Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, which I, again, like very much. You have a physical volume knob here, as you can no doubt hear, as well as the electronic parking brake, as well as the button for the sport mode. Because unlike other cars, Mazda only offers sport or not sport. Now, in terms of the driving position, everything is bang on, exactly where you would expect to be, and ergonomics in this car are pretty good. There are more buttons here on the steering wheel to control various other controls, and you have a couple of paddle shifters to manipulate the 6-speed automatic gearbox. So overall, this is a very well set up place to drive. And life for passengers isn't that bad either. With this seat setup in my driving position, I have a good amount of knee room and a pretty decent amount of headroom, again, despite that standard fit sunroof. In terms of creature comforts, well, I've got very good under-thigh support, although the middle passenger here will not benefit from that much because it's a relatively pronounced central tunnel, and of course the seat itself is not very wide. And so using this as a 4-seater, you'll be able to enjoy the cup holders here, as well as the twin USB ports down here, and of course the rear aircon vents, or crotch coolers as I like to call them, sat in the back of the center console. There is a good amount of storage back here, and what I do appreciate is that all the quality back here is as consistent as it is in the front. So everything that you touch and feel feels high quality, well screwed together, and of a relatively high quality material. Even this armrest, for example, doesn't flop down. It kind of gently folds itself into place, and I really do appreciate this level of attention to detail. It's a very Mazda thing. The other attention to detail comes in terms of the acoustics, because this car comes with an 11-speaker Bose audio system, which is fantastic. And as not to sully proceedings within the car, all of the windows in this car are done up in acoustic glass, which means these are dual laminated panes of glass all the way around in order to ensure that the cabin is quieter and more serene and only lets in the noises you want to hear, like that of the engine. See, that's the thing with most Mazdas. It's not really about anything else. It's putting a relatively practical, usable form factor on top of a fantastically good chassis. And with the Mazda 6, I'm happy to report, homicidal squirrel, that, yeah, it's business as usual. So up front, there is a 2.5-litre 4-cylinder Skyactiv G engine, which produces a decent amount of power and torque, what you'd expect from the segment, with power going to the front wheels via a 6-speed automatic Skyactiv gearbox. Everything in this car is Skyactiv. There is also G vectoring control, which debuted on the Mazda 6, I think, a couple of years ago, which helps to brake individual wheels in order to make for smoother progress, or so it claims. It sort of works very quietly in the background, so you don't really notice it. All you know is the car's very pleasant to drive. And that pleasantness is sort of what underscores the experience in the Mazda 6. Because although this car has a shorter wheelbase, a slightly sportier appearance, and a slightly sportier character, ultimately this car is just very, very pleasant to drive. These seats, for example, are incredibly comfortable. There is a good amount of bolstering on the side, as well as some adjustment to the lumbar support, only in and out, not up and down, which I think is a little bit of a shame. And there's no ventilation, but it doesn't really matter because the air conditioning in this car does a pretty good job anyway. And of course, all Mazda vehicles in Malaysia come as standard with tint, which means the amount of heat ingress is reduced anyway. But in a world of turbocharged motors, having this large very healthy 2.5-litre 4-cylinder is really refreshing, because this engine is very predictable. It does exactly what you expect it to do. No huge dollop of torque, no sudden burst, no turbo lag. It's just nice. And of course, it helps that this engine also makes a very pleasing note, which I will demonstrate to you once I hit a slightly more open road. But because this engine is very tractable, it means that you do have quite a good amount of, how should I say this, granular control over the power. Because like I said, there's no big sudden arrival of torque, there is no turbo lag, and so as a result you hit the throttle and it just sort of goes. And wherever it is that you put the throttle, you get the correct corresponding amount of go. And that's nice. And because Mazda's been making the Skyactiv G engines as well as the Skyactiv gearbox for quite some time, it does mean that they've figured out how to make both of these individual items work very, very well together. This gearbox is supremely well judged. It always knows exactly which gear to go into. It downshifts when you expect it to, and it upshifts when you expect it to. And when you hit a cruise, a high-speed cruise for example, this car will actually deactivate cylinders within the engine in order to make it a little bit more frugal. So overall, this is a very easy car to live with. Now that the road has opened up a bit, see, that's a nice, healthy noise from what is ultimately a family car. And I think that some Mazda 6 buyers would certainly appreciate that immensely. Now, from behind the wheel, there are two parts of this car that we need to discuss. The bit that goes on the motorway and the bit that happens afterwards. So when you're on the motorway, the Mazda 6 is very quiet and very comfortable indeed. Wind and road noise are very, very well suppressed, more so than you'd expect necessarily for a car of this kind. The acoustic glass all the way around certainly does a very good job at helping in that regard. And then there's the attention to detail. So for example, when you're driving along, if you were to adjust the windows in any way, the window regulators are incredibly quiet, quieter than some luxury cars for that matter. And so all of that helps when you're traveling along the motorway doing relatively high speeds, covering longer distances, because it means that this is a car that you can drive over longer distances and over longer periods without feeling uncomfortable or tired or lethargic. It makes you feel refreshed and energized. It's nice. And even in the back, again, the NVH levels are kept very, very well managed, and so everything remains very comfortable and very serene. And should you encounter a traffic jam on the motorway, you will be delighted to discover that the Mazda 6 has been updated to include Level 2 semi-autonomy, which means things like traffic jam assist, blind spot monitoring, lane keep assist, lane centering, and so on. And all of these help to feed into a driving experience that is very pleasant. But if pleasant is not for you, then there comes the other side of this car's character, which you'll discover once you leave the motorway. Because being a Mazda, the ride and handling in this car is sublime. The suspension in this vehicle is not soft or floaty. It is not quite as sharp and nuggety as what you'd get from, say, a Continental vehicle of any kind. Instead, it manages to blend a lovely amount of suppleness with a good amount of body control. As I mentioned earlier, the Mazda 6 is heavier, or rather the 6 Touring is heavier than the Saloon, but despite that, because of this well-judged suspension, you barely feel any effects at all. And because of that fantastic body control, it means that when you're stringing different curves together, changing from one direction to another, it just feels absolutely brilliant. This is a fantastic car to drive. And so to be able to offer that kind of driving experience in what is ultimately a large, practical family car is a stroke of brilliance. Sure, one could argue that the Mazda CX-5 and CX-8 also do this to some extent, but neither of those cars are nearly as engaging to drive as the Mazda 6, be it in touring or saloon guises, although we will be driving the Saloon shortly. And so, to me, every time I drive a Mazda 6 Touring especially, I can't help but wonder why anybody buys SUVs. This is a markedly better experience than any SUV that money can buy. It's comfortable, it's quiet, it's decent to drive, and it's good on fuel. Sure, in the shots earlier, you may have seen this car is doing about 9.5 kilometers per litre, but that's because this car has been idling for quite a bit in order for us to do our filming. But in actual testing, this car has quite happily returned 11.5 to 12 kilometers per litre, which corresponds to about 8 litres per 100 kilometers, which is again very good for what is ultimately a 2.5 litre naturally aspirated petrol motor powering a relatively large family car. So overall, there are very few things about this car that I dislike. If I had to nitpick, I will mention the fact that because this car has a slightly shorter wheelbase, it does mean that there isn't as much rear space for passengers as you would get in the Mazda 6 Saloon. And maybe I would have preferred a slightly more updated head unit system, because from what we sampled from the Mazda 3 and Mazda CX-30, they have gotten very good. And so it's a shame that in the Mazda 6, that's not really there. I do appreciate the Bose audio system, which does an absolutely fabulous job of recreating your music, and it just seems nice, just very nice. This car is very, very nice. If you want a little bit more space, then perhaps you'd be looking at an SUV. And while I understand the argument for SUVs, mostly because you need to feel like you can stand over other people, then the Mazda CX-5 or CX-8 will do a pretty good job too. But for everyone else, I really do genuinely believe that you need to consider vehicles like the Mazda 6 Touring before opting for an SUV. For a lot of us, it's a very simple equation. I want more space, I have a family, so therefore I'll buy an SUV. But the Mazda 6 Touring shows that you can have SUV-like practicality without the compromise. You don't need a car that doesn't drive very well. You don't need a car that lumbers about corners. You don't need a car that provides about as much driver engagement as a damp towel. This car proves that you can have family practicality in a package that still offers something for the driver. And so, for 230,000 ringgit, is the Mazda 6 Touring expensive? Yes, but as far as I'm concerned, it definitely justifies that price. Over something like a 3 Series BMW, for example, this is just a fantastic place to be. You get more kit, it's a slightly nicer interior, you get all the technology that you're looking for, and it's rare too. You don't see very many of these, which means I've no doubt that they will hold on to their value a little bit better over time. So again, all things considered, would I recommend the Mazda 6 Touring? Absolutely. This is a vehicle that I recommended even before the 23-24 model year update, but now with the inclusion of full level 2 semi-autonomy, this is an absolute no-brainer. And of course, if you want something that looks even more special, you can get this car in the Soul Red Crystal or Soul Red Metallic that they offer, which makes the Mazda 6 look absolutely brilliant. But if you are more hassled by things like ride comfort, then you might be better served by a large SUV with a softer suspension setup. And so consider vehicles like the Mazda CX-8 with its longer wheelbase, which does provide a slightly more comfortable highway ride at the compromise of dynamics. Or maybe consider vehicles like the Proton X90 or Chery Tiggo 8 Pro. Those are both cars that offer a far more comfortable experience, again at the compromise of driving dynamics. And of course, if you're spending more of your time in town, then maybe this 2.5 litre engine isn't quite for you. So again, you might benefit from the X90 with its mild hybrid system, or even a Mazda CX-5, which you can get with a 2 litre instead, because both of those cars will naturally consume less fuel when you're stuck in traffic. But if you want SUV practicality without any compromise and what I'd argue is borderline sports car dynamics, then the Mazda 6 Touring is just absolutely it. And thus concludes our review of the 2023 Mazda 6 Touring. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to be notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and WhatsApp. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.